The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Yesterday in Teisho, I spoke of the koan system in Rinzai Zen and shared a little bit about the koan system in Soto Zen, which is quite different and largely used as an intellectual exercise. And of course, in Rinzai, it's very different. In Rinzai, the koans are used to point to something beyond words and to help us open through the perplexity that comes up with koans to open to our true nature, and through that to experience some level of kensho. And of course, kensho is not just a one-time thing. It is hopefully for everyone connected with Mountain Gate, a process of having increasingly deeper kensho. Kensho in Japanese means literally seeing into, meaning seeing into the true nature of life, of our true nature of existence, of who we are really, which is not this self-image that we carry around with us out of self-defense. Along about the 13th century in China, a book of koans, a collection of koans called the Mumonkan, was gathered by a monk master named Mumon. And Mumonkan in Japanese means mu, no, mon, gate, kan, barrier. In other words, the barrier of no gate, the no gate or the gateless barrier. There's lots of different ways of expressing it. A gate is an entry into someplace or other, into your front yard, into a garden, and so on and so forth. But in this case, this environment has no gate. So it's the barrier of trying to enter into what is not possible to enter through words, through ideas, through intellect, to something profound and deep that is incredibly liberating. The Mumonkan collection was one of the first collections to be gathered in China, and it consists of a koan, and I don't know that there was any particular rhyme or reason to the order of the koans. And in fact, the first koan after Mu, the breakthrough koan, is one that is considered a very advanced koan. That is called Hyakujo's Fox, and we won't get into that today. Recall that Bodhidharma said that Zen is beyond words and letters. And it is. We cannot solve a koan in the Rinzai system by analyzing it, by thinking about it, by philosophizing about it, by using it in the same way we would ordinarily use our intellect. There's another aspect of our being that is essential to coming to awakening, and hence these koans, which have no rhyme or reason to them. They are somewhat nonsensical, some of them just don't make sense, period. And so grappling with these koans, we gradually open more and more to something that is truly beyond words, and it is remarkable. Koans were first brought to Japan, actually, in the 7th century from Chinese monks, and they have continued to this day in the Rinzai system alone, essentially. The Soto sect, as I said, has a very different way of working, And it doesn't make use of koans in the same way that Rinzai does. Years ago, I read a piece in a newsletter sent out by Zen Center San Francisco about how they work on koans, and essentially, it is as an intellectual exercise. They, in those days at least, what was reported was that they worked for each koan for 2 weeks, and in a class, and you can get a certain amount of history of a koan. You get a certain amount of history of the protagonists in the koan, the monks and the masters that were featured in the koan, but it's exceedingly rare to solve a koan in such a short time, particularly not the breakthrough koan. As I've said before, it can take decades to work through to the point of some level of kensho with a breakthrough koan, such as Mu, or the sound of one hand, or my face before my parents were born, or my original face, or who am I? And there are people that I know personally who have taken at least that long, and some longer, to break through. But if we really give ourselves to the practice, it does not matter how long it takes to break through a koan, because we are doing significant work all along the way. We're bumping into ourselves in not necessarily pleasant ways, where we are seeing up front where we're caught in delusion, basically. And all along the way, working with that koan, opening completely to the experience of whatever we meet in the process of working on the koan, we little by little become more and more free. It's not necessarily obvious. In fact, there are times in our practice when it's not at all obvious. In fact, it would seem that we're going backwards rather than forwards, or rather than deeper. But keep up the work and you will be amazed at the transformation that will happen in your life, and the peace and the ease that will come with that transformation. That is, if you not only work on the koan, but also really work on what does come up in the process of working on the koan. Because the long maturation, as it was called by Torei Enji, who was the first Dharma successor of Hakuin in Japan, and a deeply realized master whose lineage unfortunately died a few generations after him. He nailed it. He said essentially that passing a koan or having a kensho is not the end. And in fact, we can start on this long maturation, as he called it, way before we are able to pass our koan. The long maturation evolves as we get, little by little, more and more insight into our behavior, into our attitudes, into who we think we are, and put it into action. In other words, as the transformation slowly is undergone, we live it. We don't just use it as an intellectual exercise. Unfortunately, I know people who have done that, and also, unfortunately, our history in the West is that there are even people who are supposed masters who have not done that long maturation, or certainly didn't do it to any level of completion, and as a result still were dysfunctional and caused harm to their students, actually, which is quite unfortunate. So it cannot be emphasized how important this long maturation is. It's about embodying what we increasingly realize. And in Rinzai, the first practice, of course, and the ongoing practice as well, I continue to do it myself, is the extended out breath called Susokan in Japanese, because that is sort of a jet assist to our practice. If you take the breath out as far as you can, beyond where you think you can, then you have to focus on the experience of that in order to make it happen. And oddly enough, that there is this narrow focus on the experience of breathing out, but there is also an expanded awareness that comes along with it. It's a curious combination, but it's there. And what it does is help you let go stuff that impedes living fully in the moment. It also can provide a doorway to Kensho. And of course, if you have a koan, so much the better. But when you're working on a koan, at least in my own personal experience, you memorize the koan. You memorize it deeply because you're going to have to repeat it to the teacher each time you go into Sanzen. And then you let it sink into the background of your mind, where the essence of the koan, the sense of the koan is slowly revealed. And so that one day when you go into Sanzen, do your bows and recite your koan, you will unwittingly be able to express the koan without thinking of it. And in fact, if you have to think about it, you're not there yet, because the work that we do in the Zendo, coming to awakening, requires going beyond words, going beyond thinking. And I'd like to bring up one koan as an example from the Mumonkan. The Mumonkan, as I said, was developed by Master Mumon, actually. That was his Buddhist name. And it consists of 48 koans. It's a number that he just chose because he felt they were effective. And as I said, there's a batch of koans of different levels in that collection. He also wrote a commentary on the koan, and later a verse was added to most of the koans. And when we're doing the work on the Mumonkan, we take the case first, and then once that is passed, and when I say pass, that's a conditional pass, because, for example, Roshi Kapleau once said that every time he looked at a koan, and it would be the same koan because he'd been through many, many koans himself, and as he was working on it with a student, every time it came to mind, he saw a deeper meaning in it. And this is how we do continue to work on koans. We don't ever stop working on any koan. They're in the background, and we may bring them back to mind reading the commentaries of masters. There's an excellent commentary collection by Zenke Shibayama-roshi, who was a Rinzai master in Japan, a contemporary master. He's since died, but he was able to speak English, and it is a commentary in English. There are other commentaries by other Zen teachers, and they're all different. They're all relatively pointing to different aspects of these koans or different interpretations of these koans. And of course, interpretation is not what we're looking for. We're looking for a complete bodily understanding of the nature of that koan, what that koan is pointing to. So here's an example. Number 10, I think it is, in the Mumonkan, at least that's what it looked like in my eyesight, is very short. Umon asked his assembly, "The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your priest robe at the sound of the bell?" So every morning in Rinzai temples in Japan, the bell is struck to begin or to call the monks from the Zendo to the Hondo for the morning chanting. And we wear our most formal outer robe, that is called the kesa, over our regular robe. And then we go into the Hondo and we do, if it's at Sogenji, we do an hour of chanting, which is quite wonderful. To sit there early in the morning, it starts at 4 a.m., and chant. It is so enlivening and so inspirational. And so, if the world is so vast and wide, in other words, if you have had an awakening experience and you can be free, why? Why don't you just kind of hang out and stay in bed if you're tired? Why do you get up, put on your robes, go to the Hondo and chant? There's a profound truth in this. And Jacques Le Suzerain exemplified that. There he was, a prisoner in Buchenwald, the infamous concentration camp of the Nazis in Germany during the Second World War. He was 19 years old when he first was taken into the camp. He narrowly escaped immediate death because an intake prisoner whispered to him to indicate that he was a translator, and that did keep him alive. But it was a terrible environment. He said it was impossible to describe it. People were housed in barracks, and these seemingly healthy ones, or the ones that were simply of the wrong religion, for example, were housed in barracks that 400 people in a barracks was crowded. In the so-called invalids block, where he was housed because he was blind, and where other people who were missing an arm or a leg, or were blind or deaf, or were mentally ill, or had sexually transmitted diseases, or were past 70. I think they had people who were 12, men who were 12, between 12 and 70 in their block. And then when you were after 70, you were simply executed. They were ritually starved. They were fed a little bit of soup each day and some crusts of bread. And because he was blind and because the other prisoners were desperate and starving, as he was, as they all were, they stole his bread. And after 5 months of this, most of which was in the winter because he entered Buchenwald in a blizzard in January, which never ended for 6 weeks. And finally, the stress of it, the starvation, all of it gathered together to cause all kinds of very deadly illnesses within his body. His kidneys were shutting down. His GI system was malfunctioning seriously, writhing. His heart was not pumping properly and was quite irregular. His face was all swollen up with a very serious condition. He was dying. And it was verified by 3 different doctors who were also prisoners in the camp. And so he was carried away to what they called the hospital, which was simply a piece of ground that was not within the barracks, that had a little space so that people could die in a somewhat less crowded environment. And what he did was remarkable. He tuned into his body, and this is how we know all the details of what was going on with it. And he tuned into the experience, the visceral experience of his body shutting down, of his heart beating wildly out of sync, of his face being feverish and swollen, of his kidneys shutting down, of himself dying. And he wrote that he took advantage of that to leave Buchenwald. And what that meant was he left behind his ideas of what he needed to have to be happy, to be safe, to be okay. And through that experience, he had a profound awakening that was still alive for him, which testifies to the depth of it. Decades later, when he was teaching in a university in, I think, Hawaii, when he went back into the barracks, now no longer deathly ill, no one stole his bread anymore. They gave him space. They came to him with their anxieties, with their fears. They woke him up in the middle of the night to take him to other prisoners who were freaking out because he was so profoundly at peace that calmed them down. There he was, still in Buchenwald, but he was free. The world is vast and wide. Why, when the bell sounds, do you put on your priest's robe and go into the hondo and chant? That is something for each of us to really consider deeply. Of course, one cannot explain this koan. If you come into Sanzen and you offer an explanation, you're going to get wrung out because that's not what koans are about. They're about understanding viscerally, experientially, what that koan is pointing to. If the world is so vast and wide, in other words, if there's all kinds of freedom available to you, then why don't you just hang out in bed when you're sleepy? Why do you come to the hondo? Why do you go to work? And of course, this doesn't mean you walk into situations that are exceedingly dangerous or unfitting. That's not what this is about. It's about in your daily life, when you have things that are needed to do, you cook your dinner, you go shopping. If you're not hungry, you don't eat your dinner. If you're sleepy, you sleep. But if there's a responsibility there, if, for example, you have a baby in the house who is sick or crying at night, and we have someone who's part of this session by Zoom who is expecting their first child in the mid-January, and they will be faced with multiple weeks and months of not getting enough sleep, because the baby is going to need to be fed frequently, including in the middle of the night. And so you just get up and you do it. Whatever's before you that needs to be done, you take care of it. But the freedom that you can realize that allows you to take care of it without friction, without any interior grumbling, without any, oh God, do I have to do this again? That is what our practice can bring about for us. That is what Jacques Lucéron experienced in Buchenwald after he had that awakening as a result of almost dying. He didn't need to be somewhere else. He accepted the fact that circumstances were such that there he was. And so there he was. And he made the best of it. Our life is full of all kinds of situations, some of which are ones that we can grow from. Others are those that we really are better off. It's more appropriate to leave behind and to move in a different direction. Our Zen practice, our deep opening to who and what we really are, brings about the freedom to really comprehend what is appropriate for us to do in the next moment. Whether it is putting on our robes and going into the zendo and sitting zazen, even if we're sleepy. Even if it means leaving a job because it's not working. And it's not working in a deep way where we can't really make it work because that's not there for us. The situation is negative. It is possible to have an incomplete kensho, and I know someone, actually I know more than someone that description fits. In this case, this was a woman who decided to test her awakening. And so she went into a seedy hotel in a bad section of San Francisco and ended up having to jump out a second-story window to avoid being accosted by two men. It was rather unwise to walk into that hotel. And if her kensho had been deep enough, unless there was some overriding reason to go in there, which there wasn't, she wouldn't have gone in there. And she wouldn't have had to have major surgery to put her face back together after the fall. So this is another reason why we need to use everything we have in our Zen practice to not stop at a single kensho, but to continue to deepen our practice. And the various koans help with that. We have to reach a certain level of practice, of awakening, of opening, in order to be able to work on subsequent koans. The first koan, of course, the breakthrough koan, is something we can do right from, well, not quite right from the beginning. We need some stability, some basis of practice first. But I want to mention something else about koans, and that is most people have what is called a life koan or a natural koan. And it's put into words in different ways, and sometimes it cannot be put into words. When I was a child, I had this strong sense that there was something beyond ordinary life, something beyond ordinary perception, something beyond that was precious, and I needed to return to it. It took me 32 years to get to Zen practice, to find the path to opening to it again. For Roshi Kapleau, he was a court reporter during the Second World War in the Nuremberg trials in Germany and also in the war crimes trials in Japan. And he was struck by two things. One was the difference in attitude by the Germans at the end of the war, who he said essentially were, why me? When they were accused of the terrible things that they had done. Why do I have to suffer for this? Versus the Japanese, who actually apologized for the pain and suffering that they had created during the war. And during his off times in Japan, he would visit the Japanese Zen temples and the profound peace that still pervades those places reached deep into him. And so when he went back to the United States after his time in Japan as a war crimes, he took notes in this archaic form of shorthand. Now you can do it just simply with recordings, but back then you had to do it by hand, and there was a very old-fashioned type of shorthand. It was not Greg shorthand. That was invented later. He started going to classes at Columbia University with D2 Suzuki, studying Zen, because he wanted to know more about how it could be so peaceful. He had grown up in a fairly bombastic family. Both his parents were immigrants, and they were of two different religions, and it was apparently quite a flamboyant scene, let's just put it that way. And finally, because Roshi Keplo in those days was pretty full of himself, his fellow students said, look, quit talking about it, go do something about it. And so he sold his business and basically burned his bridges and went to Japan. And first encountered Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who was a very unusual Zen master who spoke English and had a great deal of friends who were artists and poets and musicians, which fit right into Roshi Keplo's love of life. And in fact, Nakagawa Soen Roshi would take him sometimes to these parties and these gatherings that his friends would give. Soen Roshi only required that Roshi Keplo sit for an hour a day, didn't matter what time, and he was not allowed in the zendo. But he had to do it an hour a day in order to stay at the monastery, and he did. And then after 3 months, Soen Roshi called him in and said, I want to take you to a sesshin. And he took him up to Obama, Japan, to Hoshinji, to a Rohatsu sesshin, which is the most difficult sesshin in the year, and translated for him for that week. Roshi Keplo fainted from the pain of the keisaku, and also that's the so-called encouragement stick. You have to know something about Japanese Zen and Japanese culture to understand that. We don't use it here at Mountain Gate, but he, first of all, was a middle-aged man. He was in his early 40s at the time, and he was not exactly flexible. That's an understatement. Although, interestingly enough, the entire time I knew him, from his mid-50s on, he sat in full lotus. He was able to do this because Daiyun Sokaku Hararoshi, who was the abbot of Hoshinji, actually did yoga, which was highly unusual in those days, immediately post-war in Japan. And so Roshi started doing yoga and limbered himself up to the point where he could sit in full lotus. And he stayed there for several years, and finally the Roshi said, because he was becoming ill from malnutrition, it was post-war, as I said, and people were having a hard time getting enough to eat. In fact, when I came back after doing a Rohatsu Sesshin at Bukokuji, which was headed by Tangen Roshi, who was one of the monks at Hoshinji when when Keplo Roshi was training there, and Roshi asked me, "Did you get any tofu during sesshin?" And I said, "Yes. Every other day we had a whole cake of tofu. Each person had a whole cake of tofu." And he said, "A whole cake of tofu?" And then he told me that when he was at Hoshinji, every 2 or 3 months, someone would donate a little bit of tofu to the temple. And of course, it was split among all the monks there, and they might get 2 or 3 bites of tofu every few months. At one point, he was in sesshin, and he had a makyo in which he was doing this, reaching, putting things down, reaching, invisible things. And afterwards, the monk near him said, what were you doing? And he had imagined himself in a grocery store in the United States pulling food off the shelves. He got into rather bad shape physically because of that lack of appropriate sustenance at Hoshinji. And so Mitra-roshi sent him out to study with Mitra-roshi, who had a kind of a roving zendo. And it was not a monastic situation. In fact, Mitra-roshi was a kindergarten teacher. And that way he could go out, rent an apartment, buy food by teaching English and making money in that way. And so he survived for the next many years, next decade, more or less. And eventually, of course, came back to the United States and chose to set up shop in Rochester, New York, exactly because it has wretched weather. And he felt that if people could not go outside and enjoy the sunshine, they would be more willing to go inside and explore deeply within themselves. And it is so. Rochester does not have very nice weather. And it's miserable in the winter and extremely hot in the summer. And in fact, I remember one memorable sesshin where 4 people fainted from the heat in the zendo. One person during the opening ceremony, the others within the first day. And it was just like that. But we did it because we were dedicated and because we felt the need to go beyond where we were, because where we were was not very much fun. And if I hadn't had the experience of recognizing at a deep level that there was nothing outside me that would ever bring lasting happiness, I would not have been willing to go to Zen practice. But I'm immensely grateful that I have done all this practice starting in January 1st, 1974. It is profoundly liberating. And everyone here has the potential to realize that liberation, whether we work on koans or not. I have no doubt that that is true. So I think that's enough. We're already a minute past the end of the period. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.